I'm going to say this once. I'm going to say it simple. And I hope to God, for your sakes, you all listen. There are no abominable snowmen. There are no Sasquatches. There are no big feet. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 13 of season 6, and we're starting a brand new series of episodes all about the world of cryptids.
Okay, so as Lisa just said, we're starting off our new series. We're talking about cryptids. If you listened to our last episode, you probably saw this coming because we talked about how it was a bridge between our series on found footage and cryptids when we talked about the movie Willow Creek, which was a found footage movie about Bigfoot. So as we usually do, this first episode in our series is just going to be kind of a discussion of, basically for this one, what cryptozoology is, a tiny bit of history about cryptids, what they are, how this idea of cryptids came to be, best we could figure. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of cryptids in film, and especially horror movies, of course. And we will talk a little bit about why we find cryptids creepy or scary, or why we're curious about them, which often in horror leads to creepy and scary things. So first off, before I get into a little bit of an explanation of the terms, the opening quote that Matt delivered for us was from the movie Harry and the Hendersons from 1987. I'm sure we've all three seen it. I think Lisa and I actually talked about it a little bit in the Willow Creek episode. It has been a long time since I saw the movie, but I saw it when I was a kid. And I'm not sure if that movie is responsible for the interests that I've kind of had in this idea of like weird creatures or not, but it's certainly an experience I had with that idea when I was a child. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of cryptozoology and cryptids, which I feel like I had an idea of what cryptids were long before I knew the term. It's probably become, I didn't look this up, but I imagine the term has become more in vogue with people because of all the kind of boom in the late 20th, early 21st century with documentary programs. I'm kind of doing air quotes. I'm searching for paranormal things in the woods and whatnot, that was not when that first happened, but I feel like there was like after ghost and paranormal search shows, that was kind of a boom in that with things like Destination Truth, etc. And so that probably is where people became more familiar with these terms. But basically, in my looking around on the internet for information about cryptozoology and cryptids, I discovered some information that was associated with Indiana University of Bloomington and from Scientific American, which kind of a pop science publication. So cryptozoology is the study of the unknown, legendary, or extinct animals whose existence or survival to the present day is disputed or perhaps unsubstantiated. And apparently, I wasn't really 100% sure about this, but apparently it was made a field of study in the 1950s. But this particular article associated with Conversations in Science at Indiana University talks about how basically a form of cryptozoology has been around for a long time. Probably they estimate since around like the 15th century BC. And this is because early ideas of cryptids, which is the shortened version for the creatures that people might be looking for. So unknown, folkloric, mythic, legendary, or perhaps extinct animals or unknown animals that people tell stories about, but we don't know if they're real. You can see this all throughout literature going back to even ancient times. So the first thing I thought of when I was thinking about this was like those maps that you look at where there's like, here are some mermaids or sirens and there's monsters over there, don't go there. The idea of like sea serpents and things like that, which we know that some aspects of sea serpents were maybe like whales or squid or octopi or things like that. So anytime someone was going somewhere that they feared or they were scared of, or they met a bunch of people that they were scared of, thinking like Cyclops, they would tell these kind of stories like, oh, that stuff over there is weird or dangerous. There's some strange creatures there. And this could be a way to warn people, like the idea of how monsters came to be, or it could just be a way to try to explain something you can't explain. If you're going out into the wilderness, which I think Lisa and I talked about in our Willow Creek episode, you may see glimpses of something, and some people may think this could be Bigfoot or a Yeti, and some people may, have other thoughts about what it could be. Feeding into this as well is the fact that, in the 20th century, you have people realizing, more and more about fossil records and things like that. And we have fish and various animals in the ocean that we're like, oh, we thought these things were extinct and they're not. And so you have people pushing like, well, if these things, we thought they were extinct, but they're not, maybe there's something in the woods, or maybe there's something in the ocean. Or maybe there's something in a lake if you're thinking of Loch Ness, which is a cryptid that goes back apparently to the 1930s. As I was looking through information about this, a book popped up that I'm really interested in reading now called Abominable Science, ! That talks a bit about the history of cryptozoology and cryptids. Another thing that I read about a little bit is that there seems to be this kind of debate over cryptozoology. So sometimes people just assume it means that, people who are pursuing cryptozoology just automatically believe that Bigfoot or Jersey Devil or Mothman or whatever it is they're searching for just exists, and that they just believe in kind of marginal theories. They don't necessarily need any sort of scientific investigation. But then there's also the flip side where people talk about, well, what if cryptozoology is a study of why people believe they see these things, and how do they start these stories? Why do we have this curiosity to wonder about these creatures, or why do we want them to be real or true? And then there is the rare occasion where something is discovered. One of the scientists writing for Scientific American said, the things that people think are out there, like Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster or something, or sea serpents, are most likely not going to ever be discovered. But we may discover something big that's living toward the bottom of the ocean that we never noticed before, because we just can't get all the way down there. And it's not something that you can do every day. And those particular organisms may not come to the surface. So I don't know that people talk a lot about cryptozoology as a field right now, because there's kind of it gets some shade thrown at it, or people who are studying it are thinking of themselves more as I'm a biologist who's looking for a rare mammal. But that was, at least from the 1950s onward, kind of the way to describe that you were looking for something that maybe really isn't extinct, or trying to find new species of thing. So I guess one of the things that I learned from this was just I was the type of person who just assumed that cryptozoology was kind of I guess crypto, as in weird. I hate to think that. And kind of felt like just finding new species was chalked up to other investigators. So apparently that's a big debate, and it's very kind of a fine edge there. So that's just a little bit of a layman's talk about what people probably mean when they're talking in your television program about cryptozoology or cryptids. And we've already talked about in a Patreon episode some of the popular cryptids. I'm sure we'll talk about more in this episode and future ones. But after that, I am going to move us from myths and legends and how they relate to science to Lisa, who is going to talk to us a little bit about how this stuff gets translated to film and lit, because if you've got folklore, myths, and legends, it's going to get translated to fiction somehow.
Yeah, and it does. And I found this really kind of fascinating, because in looking at, anytime we start a new episode series for this podcast, we always kind of tackle the subject matter in a similar way. This first episode is usually always about, why is this particular thing scary, and how has this changed over time? When did we first see the first type of film start to come up? And right away, this one felt different to me. And it makes sense listening to you, Mel, discuss kind of that there was this debate over cryptozoology as a form of a science or a form of study, or even a definition of it. Because I'm like you, whenever I heard cryptids, I just thought, oh, well, that's Bigfoot. And there's a small group of people who are kind of obsessed with finding Bigfoot, and that's cryptozoology. And I just did not think much more about it. But even now looking at the film history, I can see it's much more nuanced than that, because when I was doing some research, I was struggling to come up with what the first film that we would call like a cryptid horror film really, when did it pop up? Like, there was nobody talking about, oh, this was the first one. Like, when you're talking about vampires, for instance, it's relatively easy, to look at the film historians and hear them say, oh, this film is the first vampire film, or this book is the first vampire book, or this is the first time we see a creature that might be described as vampiric. Or zombies are the same way. It's relatively easy to think, okay, this is the first film that shows somebody coming from back from the dead, or the first film where somebody is kind of the idea of like the Haitian zombie. But with cryptids, it was so much harder. So here's kind of what I went through in this journey into film history. When I just started looking up the first cryptid horror movies, I was pulling up a bunch of what I would call creature features. And we've talked about creature features in monster movies before, but they're something different. When you have a monster movie, like a monster coming in and destroying something, or even like what a lot of people were pointing to as like a first cryptid, they were talking about like the Wolfman, for instance. And I thought, well, that's not really fair, because that's a werewolf, and a werewolf isn't a cryptid. And then I thought, well, why isn't a werewolf a cryptid? Like, what is my definition here? So my definition, at least in working through this, is what is like a cryptid has to come from a certain legend. Like, it has to be something like a Yeti or an abominable snowman or Loch Ness, you've mentioned. Some sort of local legend where people have seen a creature that's out in the woods. I didn't want the creature to be connected to any sort of like magic, or werewolves kind of fit into that idea of like, it's a legend, yes, but it's also kind of magic, because it has to happen under like the full moonlight, and there's transformation, and like a human can become a werewolf at some point, and as far as I know, like a human cannot become Bigfoot. So it has to be its own separate species, and then it has to be something that I would not consider supernatural, like not part of that supernatural world. In other words, this is a quote unquote real thing, like a real breathing species that we just don't know about yet. That was kind of my definition of it. So I thought, okay, this is where I'm going. So my first, kind of going back into it, my very first film that I could find was a film called The Abominable Snowman. In the US, it was released as The Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas. It's from 1957. It's a British film. Actually, it was produced by Hammer. So it's a Hammer film, and it is about a Yeti. It's about some scientists who go out into the Himalayas in search for this like legendary creature. And of course, they find it. It stars Peter Cushing. It's directed by Val Guest, who directed quite a few of the Hammer horror and sci-fi films. So, and actually, film historians, I couldn't find where they were talking about it being really the first cryptid. I did find them talk a lot about how it fit into Hammer's like overall history. But they did say that they felt like they could see similarities between this film, like in particular where they're going out into the wilderness and it's just kind of like wasteland where they're getting lost. And finding similar things in later movies, particularly the Blair Witch Project was one that they had brought up, which I thought was really kind of interesting. So as far as I can tell, The Abominable Snowman, the 57 Hammer film, might be the first one. Now, I deliberately overlooked The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which would have preceded this by 3 years, mainly because, again, the Black Lagoon felt more like a creature feature. if it had been tied, I think, to a specific legend that existed outside of the film, like the Loch Ness monster, I might have included it on the list. It was very close. I kind of went back and forth over whether or not we were counting that as a cryptid, but I ended up just kind of pointing to this one that came out in the 50s. Really interesting. There were not many abominable snowman or really any cryptids at all that popped up for another 20 years. So it wasn't until you got to the 70s that things really started picking up again with movies like The Legend of Boggy Creek, Creature from Black Lake, Snow Beast, which is another Yeti one. And then there was a kind of another weird jump to the 21st century. And really, you didn't see many until you got to like the Mothman prophecies, which was in 2002. And several of them came after that. I'm not saying these are all great, but there was like Leeds Point, which dealt with the Jersey Devil, Willow Creek, which we've talked about, The Barrens, which was another Jersey Devil one, and then Exists, which came out a few years ago and is another found footage Bigfoot movie. There were a surprising number of cryptid comedies. I don't know. I'm surprised really and truly that there's not more cryptid horror out there. And it's weird that it does seem to come in these waves. You had the Abominable Snowman of 57, but then it was pretty quiet until you got to the 70s, and there seemed to be this weird uptick. And then this period from like, I'd really say like 2002 to like 2015, there were a few, I don't know if I'd call them B movies, but lower budget horror films. So yeah, it was really kind of interesting looking at the history of this. And just the fact that it doesn't seem to be as big of a subgenre as I was expecting it to be. But I don't know, guys, maybe I'm way off on how I defined cryptids. I guess we'll just kind of start by jumping in there. Like, how would you define a cryptid? I mean, I know there's kind of the scientific, and I'm using air quotes there. It's almost like a cross between legend and science. But I don't know, how would y'all even begin to define cryptid? Because maybe I feel like that's part of the problem in looking up these films.
I was just going to say, when I first saw the Creature from the Black Lagoon on your list, I kind of thought, wow, maybe that is a cryptid, though I'd always thought of it as a creature feature. But because it is like, if I remember right, there's scientists like looking for they're exploring it because they want to find a new species, and they kind of do find a new species. But then I totally understand what you're saying about most cryptids seem to be fueled by legends or myths, right? Like a bunch of people see something and they tell stories and it becomes this mystery. And maybe it is something new, or maybe it's just a story. So I don't know. I also find myself kind of going back and forth on this, because if it doesn't have the myth or the legend, or it doesn't have like some sort of local lore or a bunch of like shaky cam sightings, can it qualify for like what we think of in popular imagination as what a cryptid is? Or is it just like, oh, there's this thing we haven't discovered yet? I mean, if you don't have I don't know, if like Godzilla wasn't super huge, would he be a cryptid? You see what I mean? Like, I actually started going around in circles with this in my mind earlier today.
well that is exactly what I was doing, and kind of compiling this history. I skipped over a few, like, there's actually a movie called The Loch Ness Horror, because I thought there's got to be a Loch Ness movie out there. But I was kind of going through my brain like that, because then I thought, well, where do like kaiju land in this? Like, they're all like cousins in a weird way, but how do we define it? And I kept coming down on the idea that like it had to be a thing that could plausibly be real, and we just haven't discovered it yet. Right? Like, somebody might talk to me about like werewolves, for instance, but I'm not convinced that werewolves might be living in packs in the woods, because I haven't heard those stories. Like you said, I haven't seen any like grainy footage. But like with Bigfoot, not saying I'm a believer, but like I can see where people would believe that that could be true, because there are vast amount of wilderness that we have not fully explored. And people claim to have come back with like evidence of fur, or the video, or the photographs, or like a footprint or something like that. And so maybe it's that. Maybe it's like the search for evidence that happens outside of the story that makes it a cryptid. Because as far as I know, nobody's out there trying to prove that Godzilla is real. Or are they? But I don't think so. So I think that's what it has to be. It has to be that there's a search to try to prove that it's real outside of the story itself.
Yeah, I completely agree. There has to be like either a scientific or pseudoscientific reason. Like and I think that's why it lends itself so well to documentaries, mockumentaries, and found footage, because the idea is it used to be just stories, but now it's like I have this iPhone video of it or something. And maybe that's leads to I'm gonna hear what Matt has to say too, but maybe that's also what leads to the waves in the movies too. Because I mean, what was it? We talked about the Patterson Gimlin film that came out in the late '60s, and then you got a spate of Bigfoot movies in the '70s. Like, I wonder if there's like waves of interest depending upon the stories that are floating around. And of course, then you have really granular, small, like super local legends that we're never really going to know about unless we know someone there happened to travel there. I love this idea, though, of like carving up all the creatures into different things. Like kaiju are huge, and these are nature gone wild, and these are cryptozoology. I think this is kind of what we end up doing on this podcast a lot, is like kind of shaving these terms down and coming up with compartments, and it can be really fun. Matt, what's your take on this?
Well, I agree with both of you that the term as it is often used for cryptid is a slippery sort of thing that and I'm glad that we're trying to come up with a better definition or a more concrete definition. But I don't know that I have too much else to add to what you both were saying, but I do think that the plausibility of actual existence is probably a key facet. Well, like you said, Lisa, I haven't heard any people claiming to have actually seen Godzilla in any form, or any other type of kaiju for that matter. And I mean, while they're interesting as monsters or creatures, I just don't. I think, like you said, that the plausibility or even the search for actually having seen them or evidence of their actual existence in the real world is probably the best way to really pin down this particular word's meaning, especially as how we're probably going to use it, because I just I don't think that it's concrete enough the way people tend to use it. It like I said, it's slippery, and different people use it in slightly different ways.
Yeah, I feel like, from listening to what you were saying, Matt, that like while I initially was like kaiju, not cryptid, I feel like you could maybe do a movie or a piece of fiction that made kaijus cryptids to a certain extent. You just have to have a lot of build up where there was grainy video of like, why is this island moving, or oh my gosh, we're being attacked. Like you would have to build up a mythos more than what's already done in kai, just in like we think kaiju are real because part of like this island's folklore. Like you would have to make it like that's not a storm, that's just kaiju, and people are like, no way. And there's like documentary shows trying to find kaiju. If you did that, then maybe you would verge on pushing on cryptid, because it'd be like, this was extinct, or we thought this was extinct, but it came from the floor of the ocean and got us. But I mean, the way kaiju are set up with like the folklore and the nuclear connection and the climate connection, things like that, they're trying to achieve a different kind of horror. But now I'm like, I would like this kind of weird fake documentary about kaiju possibly being real. It might be a lot more work than it's worth, but I'm wondering if there's ways to massage creature features to make them work within the parameters of cryptids.
I think
Yeah.
in some way you could with some of them. I don't think all of them, but I think there's a case for the first Godzilla movie, going back to our Summer of Kaiju from almost a year ago now. But I'd say the first Godzilla movie could kind of qualify, mostly because it's a
That's true, because
local,
he was awakened,
and
right? So he
he was
was
like,
real.
yeah, and he was like a
Yeah.
local legend that dated back hundreds and hundreds of years, rather than purely being like a lizard that was irradiated and then became giant and smashy. Like he was a long-standing local legend for the small island where he originates. So I think you could make that case. I wouldn't push it too hard. I think it sort of really stretches the definition of cryptid, but
Yeah, I
I'd
agree.
say I'd say in some cases it's possible. Now, if someone came to me and said Pacific Rim are cryptids, I would laugh in their face. So that's
Aliens can't be cryptids. Yeah, I definitely feel there has to be like there's stories and then there's discoveries, because, and I this is something for us to talk about elsewhere, but we have discovered a lot of animals. There are stories that people have in certain areas of the world about, oh, there's this crazy animal and we're scared of it, and it turns out it is real. It's discovered and it's given a name, and then of course it's got to deal with humanity knowing about it. So yeah, I feel like in order to have a cryptid, you've got to have the fictionalization of that experience. Like you were saying, Matt, I liked your word about plausibility. There has to be a plausibility. And that also possibly leads to the horror of it too, if you use it in a fictional narrative.
Well, I'm going to push that just a little bit further. Like, I don't think it has to be a plausibility. I think it needs to be an existing legend prior to whatever the story is being made. Like, I think that's why Godzilla, even though Godzilla within the first film is a cryptid because it is a legend, like Godzilla was created by the filmmakers. There, you know what I mean?
So you want a real world legend?
I think for it to truly qualify as a cryptid, it has to be a real world legend. It has to be. We all know stories of the abominable snowman. There are so many kids movies that are made about Yetis. It's ridiculous. That's a living legend that exists. Loch Ness is a living legend that exists. Bigfoot, the Jersey Devil, the Mothman. Even before those movies were made, and I don't even live near the areas, I had heard those stories. So I think that's what makes it, that is what I think is defining. If you're really going to like pinpoint, I think it has to be an existing legend.
So do we now have the canon rule of Lisa's laws of cryptids, or
Yes.
like the disaster movies? We must have a local legend.
And I feel like, that is what makes it cryptozoology, right? Like, it's not just the possibility that it could exist, because heck, like, I will probably be convinced forever that vampires could exist, right? Like, that's completely plausible in my world. But I feel like it because the fact that there's a legend that exists prior to like whatever film is being made, that gives it a plausibility that's beyond just like one person, because like a group of people have gotten together and agreed that it's plausible. And it goes back to what you pointed out was like kind of the first cryptid was the sphere of the unknown. Like in ancient times when you would have the maps that are like, there would be monsters here. I feel like sea monsters are probably the original cryptid, because the sea has super insane things in it. I mean, really terrifying. And I can't even imagine what it would be like to be out on like a ship or a boat and see something and just be like, oh yeah, that's a monster.
And you have no motor or anything. Like, who knows what came up to them? So their stories were probably just crazy.
Right. And if you've never seen something, yeah, it's probably in your mind. The more you replay it, it's going to get bigger and bigger. But like, what I find more fascinating is why in particularly like American cinema, like, well, not American, more specifically like cinema of the US, why we've pinpointed certain cryptids to focus on. Like, it always seems to be in horror movies, it's like Bigfoot or maybe like the Jersey Devil.
Or the jackalope.
Yes. But like, why don't we do more with sea monsters? I mean,
and there is supposedly cryptid in America is what it off the Pacific Northwest, right? The sea serpent thing with the horse head or whatever. Like, I can't think of any movies about that.
Well, I think part of it too has to do with how big America is. I mean, it's so sprawling that I'm sure along the coasts there may be more cryptid legends that relate to sea monsters, but it doesn't surprise me that something like Bigfoot would take hold because so much of it, like geographically, is sparse and uninhabited, or like forested land, or just uninhabited land like that. So I mean, if we were a smaller nation or an island nation, I could see cryptids that are more sea based being more popular. But I mean, I'd say that's like geography plays a big part of it.
you don't think
Yeah.
it's that we tend to go towards the more human like ones?
Well, I think that's part of it too. I mean, we definitely. I mean, I think we tend to anthropomorphize practically everything anyway. So it's how we relate things is putting it into ways that we can understand. It's, you know, same way with people seeing faces in clouds. It's that part of our brain that's like evolved to make noise out or make sense of the noise, basically. So I think that would be a big part of it too. Like Bigfoot in particular, the anthropomorphization, if that's a word.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that because one of the key things with cryptids is, at least, I mean, we saw it with Bigfoot in Willow Creek. Now, I'm leaving out some of these like Jersey Devil, Mothman ones because those do seem to have a supernatural bent to them, which we can talk about. But at least with like, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yetis, abominable snowmen, the ones that seem to be more human, it's really kind of fascinating because a lot of the legends surrounding them is that these creatures are very smart, and that's why they've been able to like evade discovery for so long. Like, they're able to bury their dead, for instance, and that's why we don't see just like dead bodies lying around. We don't come across them in the woods, or they're very like adept at hiding from people, and that they've got these like complex social structures and they live in communities, or whatever people are like putting on them. But I find it really interesting that those are the ones that were like, oh, they're really very smart, and those are the ones who look most human. Like, it seems to say something about our own like collective ego as a culture, that it's not some like serpent out in the desert. It's not like a sandworm that is the cryptid we're like fascinated with, or it's not Loch Ness. It's, which I'm pretty sure a bunch of the like Great Lakes probably have their own version of like Nessie. So, but it's the ones that look human that are the ones that become part of our cultural conversation, which I don't know. Again, I just think that says more about us than really them. I'm sorry, Mel. I think I cut you off. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, you're fine. I was just about to say that, I think it's kind of a mix of the two, because if you think of, I did like what Matt was saying about the fact that if you don't live next to water, it makes those water serpents or whatever much more localized. Or was it Champy in Lake Champlain in New England, which I don't think that I'd have to go look up more about that, but I've always felt like that was not necessarily like a vilified monster, like a dangerous one per se. But I like this idea of melding both of your theories together for Bigfoot because of the fact that we have such a widely forested area, which of course we've cut down, but you've got a century or more of stories stories, even within, indigenous groups of possible, like, I guess, Bigfoot type creatures living in the forest. There are way more. I don't know. I'd have to look at actual numbers, but I would imagine there's probably a lot more of like a connection in our American mythos with the idea of forests. It definitely was our original horror to a certain extent. And I feel like there's more people who can be like, there's a Bigfoot in the woods around the swamp, or there's a Bigfoot. I mean, there's a Bigfoot supposedly in Oklahoma and Kentucky and out west. And, a cryptid appeared in the series Reservation Dogs, actually, was spoken about, that came out the last year. It's kind of ubiquitous. And I wonder if it's because Bigfoot fits in a lot of our American geographical locations so that I can be close to it. When Mothman started supposedly appearing outside of West Virginia, and when the books were written about Mothman that went outside West Virginia, it exploded. So I wonder if there's something about like, I'm close to this. I have, it's not just such a tiny location. I don't know about it, but I like your idea too, Lisa, about it's the monster that's most like us. Like a sea serpent can just be scary because it's so other, but something that we suspect may have intelligence or be like us or might be sneaky or hiding or I don't know. It's interesting. It changes it in a way. So I wonder if I guess what I'm saying is I wonder if it's more people are closer to a Bigfoot legend than say a Jersey Devil, and because it's just more ubiquitous. But also, yeah, I think you're right. There is what Matt was saying about anthropomorphizing our monsters. Sometimes when we do that, maybe it makes them a little scarier. Yeah. I think we talked about similar things actually with aliens, but I wonder if it's a mix of those two.
Yeah, I do wonder if, I mean, when we're getting into like why cryptids are scary, I think a big part of it is the same thing it's been since the beginning. um which is the fear of the unknown. Like any time you go into some sort of wilderness or unexplored territory, it's going to be scary, and I think that plays up that part of it. But I do like where you're going, Mel, with the comparison to aliens and our discussion of aliens, especially the series we did just a few months ago on alien abductions and why that kind of hits a nerve with us. And part of it is you're right, is it's this thing that we feel like we should be able to connect to, especially the more humanoid ones. Like, we should be able to communicate with them, or we should be able to strike up some sort of peace with them. But like we were talking about with the aliens, it is something, for lack of a better word, completely alien to us, right? Like that there's a reason we have that word. It's something that is like not human. And so we can't connect to it. And that's kind of the point. And I think it's the same thing with these cryptids, with these like Bigfoot, big feet. I don't know if we ever landed on what the plural was going to be, the Sasquatches, where you feel like you should be able to communicate, but really the terror comes in when you can't. When you realize that you don't have anything in common, that you don't have any similarities you can like rely on. And plus, I think just the absolute sheer strength of them. I mean, everything that we're talking about, the Yetis, the abominable snowmans, which I don't know if they're the same ones. Kind of like I'm not sure if Bigfoot and Sasquatch are supposed to be the same thing. I use the terms interchangeably, but I'm not sure. But it's this idea of just pure strength that is also terrifying. It's being completely incapacitated, which is really, really kind of terrifying when you look at it. I know we're running close to our time. I do want to throw out, though, as we're just kind of getting into cryptids a little bit, because we've talked about mainly the ones that do kind of appear more human. But I've mentioned the Jersey Devil and I've mentioned the Mothman. And I know I've been fascinated by those two cryptids in the past. Mel, I know you have as well. But what do we do with these kind of cryptids that feel, I don't know, to me, they feel more supernatural, especially like the Mothman supposedly shows up is like an omen of coming death or like something bad happening. And then the Jersey Devil has all sorts of legends behind it. Like I've heard it's like the 13th son of the 13th daughter, or, all this kind of legend that draws around it. And that's why it's formed. They're also, worth pointing out, less human than like the Sasquatch or the Yeti because they're both winged. I don't know because I don't know if they fit in so well with how we've been talking about cryptids. Because I don't know, do people go out searching for the Jersey Devil or the Mothman in the same way they go out looking for Bigfoot?
That's a good question. I feel like though, I feel like Mothman is a cryptid because it's fulfilling the other criteria of your law that we that we created tonight. Because Mothman, you have you have kind of the grainy footage, right? You have supposed photos, you have the stories, you have all the new old newspaper articles, you have a museum to Mothman. I want to say there may even be like supposed video. I mean, I feel like you've got the local legend aspect of it, and the fact that it could be something that's a real animal that people are confusing with a creature by perhaps anthropomorphizing it and making it part man, part bird or moth or whatever. Even with the supernatural aspect, some people do interpret it as one of those like ambivalent creatures, that's like slightly supernatural or paranormal, and that it appears as a warning, but it's ambivalent. It doesn't necessarily, it's not going to like help you or hurt you per se. But it is a complicated one because, I mean, in its development, like it's pulled in, people who are interested in aliens and UFOs too. But I feel like at its core, Mothman started as people seeing things that they couldn't explain, which was possibly migrating birds from a different area. And then they started all these stories. Now, what's happened to Mothman since that, with the more supernatural connections and the alien aspects? I think that was kind of tacked on to something that we originally would have thought of as a cryptid. The Jersey Devil, I'm not so sure about. I don't know as much about it, though I am kind of aware of it. But I don't know. That's what I think about Mothman, is that even if Mothman comes with baggage that you don't believe is cryptid, that character did start out as a legend. I mean, that is a legend that has its own kind of even tourist spot, even. And I mean, there's another cryptid actually in West Virginia that was near where I live there, the Flatwoods Monster, and that is extremely tied to aliens, which I'm not 100% sure why that seems to happen there with those creatures. But I don't know. Is that a good enough explanation? Mothman started out as what you would think of as a tried and true cryptid, and then maybe he got co-opted into other fictional narratives.
Yeah, it does. Because, when you look up the original Mothman, the original sighting, the couple that saw it says that they saw a man-sized bird. So, like, the idea of it, they literally saw just a giant bird, which to me very much sounds like cryptid territory because it's something that could plausibly exist that maybe we just haven't seen before. Also sounds kind of terrifying. But then when I look up the Jersey Devil, that one does go back to this idea of a woman who gave birth to her 13th child, and then that 13th child was like cursed. So from the very beginning, like something like the Jersey Devil seems to be more of a supernatural type folklore than somebody saw a creature out in the wilderness and couldn't explain it. Because I think you're right in pinpointing that. Like, even though the Jersey Devil, I would have probably previous to this discussion said, oh yeah, that's definitely a cryptid story. Now I'm thinking it's more of a supernatural legend in the same way that like the Blair Witches I mean, at least presented in the movie. But yeah, I think that we might have like really nailed it down with that. Like it has to be something that a legend grew out of, like a sighting where somebody was in a wilderness type area and saw some sort of animal or creature that they could not explain. That's about as close as we're going to get, guys, I think.
I will say that definition does cut out some things that people have traditionally thought of as cryptids, like the Wendigo, or was it the Rougarou? Like, if you completely say that a only folkloric creature, then can't be, it has to also be like grainy footed. You see what I mean? Like, you're then kind of cut it. Like, then we're creating like a folkloric creature category.
I would believe that. Like, I would absolutely believe that.
And I wasn't reprimanding you there. I was just pointing that out.
No, I think you're right, because if you had asked me prior to doing this conversation what my favorite cryptid was, I would a million times say it was the Rougarou, because to me that's like it's a swamp beast. But actually having, I don't know, actually having talked our way through this, maybe not, because the Rougarou does kind of fit in with like the werewolf mythology, which I would not classify a werewolf as a cryptid for every reason we've talked about. Because even though people will say like, oh, I saw that out in the woods, like there seems to, okay, I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but this may be the last thing I have to say on it. There's a difference between, I went out in the woods, like not expecting to see anything, and I see a bird the size of a human, and I try to take a picture of it, and I try to tell people about it later. That's a cryptid, right? Versus somebody's told me a story about the woods being haunted by this creature, and so I go into the woods and I hear like a rustling in the leaves, and I scare myself and I say, well, that must be the creature. Like, to me, those are two different, like the origin story, I think, is going to be crucial to what makes something a cryptid and what makes something a folklore monster. Did it originate with people just telling stories because they wanted to tell a story? Like the Rougarou is often told to scare children, like, don't get out of bed, the Rougarou is going to get you. Right? But as far as I know, like, Bigfoot originated because somebody thought they saw something in the woods. That's the difference. It had to be like a real experience, a real sighting. Somebody really thought they saw the Mothman in the woods, and we can pinpoint who it was and the date it happened, versus here's a story about the Jersey Devil that sounds kind of made up. I've talked myself into circles now.
No, I don't think so. I think listeners are getting their money's worth here. We are really driving down to the brass tacks of what it means to be a cryptid. But no, I see what you're saying. Like, I feel like now, I don't know, that's interesting. Or at least if it's a folkloric monster, it has to have stories where people claim they saw something. Like, you're saying the visual, like, I saw that, like, if somebody told you there was a story where somebody claimed they saw a werewolf, then you'd be like, okay, that's verging into cryptid, because we need that kind of plausible, whatever. Like, we need to be like, somebody thought they saw this.
Yes.
They had an experience, like a contact experience.
It goes back to what we all were talking about at the beginning with the idea of cryptozoology. Is it a science? Is it a pseudoscience? To me, it doesn't really matter. But it pinpoint, it goes down to that idea of investigation. Like, as far as I know, nobody is out there seriously like saying, hey, I've got proof that a werewolf exists. I've got the hair from a werewolf and I'm getting it tested in this lab. But people do that for Sasquatch. You know, nobody's showing me a grainy picture of a vampire and saying this is proof that vampires really do exist. But people will show grainy pictures of what they think is the Mothman. I feel like that has to be the difference. And those things existed prior to like the films and the books being made. Like it was already out there. That part of it is the folklore aspect, but like I think we can't, the zoology part of it is something we can't like ignore. It's that investigative nature, whether it's a pseudoscience or not. I'm not going to get into that argument, but I think that is really what makes it a cryptid. And then maybe, I don't know, then maybe Jersey Devil does get thrown back in there, because I'm pretty sure there are people who go out looking for the Jersey Devil, even if it did originate from a folklore. So that one we may want to throw back in.
Yeah, I guess it depends on, like you said, most likely no one's looking for vampires or werewolves, but if they are looking for something based on a myth, that might push it into our white hot center. But the white hot center, as far as we're operating from now, is that it has to have that zoology part in it. It has to have the investigative aspect.
Man, it's the deconstruction of it all, because I think we've pulled that thread as much as we can go without unraveling it. But I will say that I'm excited for this series. I'm excited to, actually watch some of these cryptid horror movies and talk about them, because I think it's going to be a lot of fun. All right. Well, I guess with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this episode. If we still have people listening after that long discussion of what makes a cryptid. I'm maybe still confused and thinking about this till our next episode, but we are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you've got a better definition of what a cryptid is, or what makes something cryptid horror, we would love to hear that. Also, if you've got a candidate for an earlier film than the one I mentioned, that was like the first cryptid horror that we could find, love to hear that as well. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. You can get access to exclusive content over there. We just did a really fun episode on our favorite cryptid. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.